Okay, it is 11 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started right on time. Welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for this exciting webinar. To those of you who may not know me, my name is Jen Birchfield. I'm the Northwest Indiana Urban Waters Coordinator. My position is housed at Purdue University Northwest. And if you're not familiar, many of you might be our Urban Waters partners, but if you're not familiar, Urban Waters is a federal partnership working in different locations across the country. We're working obviously here in Northwest Indiana with more than 80 partners, a range of both federal agencies, local nonprofits, even for-profit companies, all working together to restore our urban waters and revitalize our communities. So we're excited today to bring you our first, what we're calling webinar, with one of our partners, Shirley Heinze Land Trust. I will do just a few housekeeping items as we get started here, and then I will turn things over to Eric Bird with Shirley Heinze Land Trust. So just a couple of housekeeping items for Zoom. Hopefully everyone like me is getting a crash course in Zoom and starting to get more comfortable with it. But I do just want to point out a few things. If you scroll kind of at the bottom of your screen, there is a chat icon that will open up the group chat to the right. There are options to mute and kind of toggle your video options. I do have, I believe, everyone muted at this point. We're going to get right into Eric's presentation, and I believe, Eric, we had planned to kind of hold questions until the end generally. So I would just encourage people, if you do have a comment or a question that you don't want to lose, you're welcome to put that in the chat, but we will be getting to those after the presentation. I do want to make everyone aware that we are recording today with the intention that if anyone isn't able to be with us in person, we can share the recorded file with them. And lastly, I have been working to kind of test drive some options. We recognize that we really need to make closed captioning available to our partners. And so if you look in the chat box, I have pasted a link to an app called Otter, where I am recording a live kind of transcript of the meeting. It might be a little clunky to open that link and kind of keep it open to the side, but if you are interested in closed captioning, you're welcome to use that. We're still kind of working out the kinks and testing that out at this point. And so I believe that is all I had to say. And with that, we'll go ahead and get into the presentation. I'd like to welcome and thank our presenters today. Eric Bird is the Director of Stewardship with Shirley Heinze Land Trust. We were very excited to talk with Eric and coordinate together to offer this presentation that I think will be really useful to our Urban Waters partners and anyone else who may be joining us. So Eric, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you. Yeah, so if any of you have ever seen me give a presentation in real life, I do like to take questions while I'm talking, but that's obviously very hard to do on Zoom. And if you see me looking away, it's because I have two screens. I have a big screen behind my camera that I'm looking at. So thank you. Thanks for the opportunity of doing this today. We recently finished a climate resiliency initiative project, and part of that project is to communicate that and sort of advocate the process to partners. So I really appreciate, I was kind of scrolling through everybody that joined. I really appreciate everybody tuning into this. I'm seeing a lot of my friends and partners and things like that on here. So welcome, thank you, good to see you. So I'm gonna talk today about this project and a little bit about the process that we went through. I saw a few people on here that joined us in the process, so you're already kind of aware. And just talk about how you could do the same thing if you're a land manager, or there's a lot of different ways to kind of use this process. So thank you. So I'm going to talk just briefly about who I am if you're unfamiliar with Shirley Heinze Land Trust, and talk a little bit about our stewardship program, a little self-flattering about our program, recent achievements, and some of the work that we've been doing. And then I'm going to kind of jump into the project that we did And what you see there is basically like some of the steps to the project. So I'll go through that process a little bit. So Shirley Heinze Land Trust is a land trust. We're accredited by the Land Trust Alliance. We were given an award for excellence in conservation by them after our first year of accreditation. Land Trust Alliance is just like an umbrella for land trusts in the nation to work under. So it shows that you have good practices, good business models, things like that. We were started in 1981 in memory of Shirley Heinze, Dr. Shirley Heinze. She was a resident of Ogden Dunes. She passed away at a relatively early age, and her friend set up a foundation called the Shirley Heinze Environmental Fund. So we've been around for a while. We recently sort of went over and redid our mission and added some of our values, but basically our mission is to act like a land trust and preserve land, restore it and take care of it through our stewardship program, but also to engage people. So there's a lot of public access, education opportunities, outreach opportunities. And you can see there some of our values that we've created more recently to just sort of express that vision, values sort of thing. Conservation obviously is a big part of it. Collaboration, a lot of you, I've worked with a lot of you, and partnerships is what makes us strong. It's what makes us get a lot more work done. Integrity, so that's part of the accredited by the Land Trust Alliance. We try to do everything honestly and open and straightforward. Inclusiveness of all people in our nature preserves and all of the programs that we do, we're always working on that. And then innovation, which is kind of what this falls under. We're trying to reach a new level of sophistication and always trying to find new tools in our toolbox and follow what other land trusts have done that have been successful with, and do things that will work for our area and in our communities. So our stewardship program is a big part of the organization, and we do a lot of things. We wear a lot of different hats. When we started in 1981, it was all volunteers. Until maybe the 80s or so, we had a mid-late 80s, we had an executive director position and a stewardship position. But in the last couple of years, we've had as much as 12 just on the stewardship staff or seasonal staff. We now have a stewardship staff of 3 that are permanent, full-time, year-round. We do all of the monitoring and defense, so we preserve areas and we have to monitor those and make sure that they're protected. We do a lot of invasive species management and restoration projects. And like I said, we're trying to get beyond just invasive species management and do more sophisticated project and work with new sets of tools in a lot of new ways. I mentioned that we have public access on a lot of our properties, so we're always trying to enhance that and better the experience for the visitor. We handle all the science and data, all the maintenance of everything, the equipment, the properties, the parking lots, the amenities, buildings, that sort of thing. And then there's a lot of sort of what I like to call like sub-programs within the stewardship program or other programs in Shirley Heinze, education outreach, things like this, guided hikes, special events, that sort of thing that we're always working on. We started in 2016 using ARC Collector to collect data on places that we've treated invasive species. So these red, blue, and purple shape files that you see are the last few years of invasive species, so 17, 18, and 19, that we've been treating on a lot of our properties. So when I came into Shirley Heinze Land Trust, that's really what we were working on, getting invasive species off of our properties. We've been blessed with Sustain Our Great Lakes projects, Chi-Cal Rivers Fund projects that have allowed us to do a great amount of restoration. We probably do about 100 acres a year in like special projects, restoration and intensive invasive species work. And on top of that, our regular routine maintenance, follow-up, that kind of stuff that we're always doing regardless of our grant projects. We've done a lot for access enhancements. That was also a big part. I've been at Shirley Heinze for about 5 years. We've got these new preserve signs that look like the national park signs. We've tried to improve our entranceways and trails and information that we have at the trailheads. We had a volunteer, Dale there, had made us some new sign-in boxes and map boxes. We highlight our partnerships on our signage with new improved signs. We get new preserves and we try to make public access with parking areas and trailheads right away. We've done quite a bit on the river with river access. So there's a couple of places on Shirley Heinze you can put a canoe and kayak in. You can visit our trails, and there's interpretive signs. You can sort of have self-guided tours. And then just always working with volunteers, making special places, things like that. These volunteers are working at Barker House. They're restoring a historic fence. You may have seen some of our posts about restoring the windmill. So really thanks to the volunteers for doing that, but just our first sort of steps to doing some historic preservation, which is also an important part of preservation, right? Not just ecological, but historic resources are important as well. I mentioned science and data. So this table just shows how many plants we've added to our master flora list. We keep a big long tab on an Excel spreadsheet of all of the plants that are on all of our properties. And in the last 3 years, we've added 255 new plant species to that list that we're blessed to have some qualified staff that really work at this and go out and find new plants. And that's not just because of new properties and finding new plants, but finding new species on properties we already own and manage. So Ambler, Leidick, Crestmore, Coulter are some of our state dedicated nature preserves. And a lot of these places we've added over 100 species. Those are some of our most species rich properties. On top of that, I mentioned we use Art Collector to collect information in the field in real time about invasive species, rare plant locations. But there's also all these new applications coming out. There's a lot of citizen science programming like the Frog Call Workshop, the Hoosier River Watch, that allows us to see an enormous amount of data that we didn't have before. So things like EdMaps with invasive species, or iNaturalist or eBird, when people are taking that data on our property, I can go on and look at that and see new bird species we didn't know were on the property, or new plants or fungus. And many of you are probably familiar with iNaturalist, and now they have these apps that can identify things for you. And although it's maybe not 100% accurate, it gives me a lot of good information about our properties. And we're so very grateful for the citizen scientists that are out there doing that kind of work. And it just makes our stewardship work better informed and more sort of science-based. So to summarize, we wear a lot of hats, and we're trying to be more sophisticated. And I thought this photo of Aziz is quite apt for displaying that. We're always treating and restoring properties. I would say invasive species work is sort of the #1 bulk of how we spend our time in the stewardship program, but also the public access and then collecting data and monitoring. We're always trying to improve. We're always trying to do more. We're always finding new ways to do more, and we're very proud of that. And again, that kind of goes back to the climate change thing. That's always been on our mind. That's always been in the background of what we do. And we're just trying to be a little bit more sophisticated with it, do a little more intense workshop on it, to start adding those things to our management plan and really be working on the climate change initiatives in how we manage our properties. So we got a grant from the Land Trust Alliance. They have a new land and climate program that's kind of focused on climate change and promoting climate change initiatives. And through that grant, we were able to work with folks from the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. So they're sort of an interdisciplinary group of scientists, land managers, that sort of thing, that work on climate change initiatives. We used the process through the climate change response framework, which is basically adapted from this book. And if you haven't seen this book, put out by the U.S. Forest Service, this publication, Forest Adaptation Resources, Climate Change Tools and Approaches for Land Managers. It's really a good book if you're just starting to think about management plans, or you're putting management plans into place for some of your properties. It's a good thing to go through. Like I said, we're all always thinking about climate change, but it's important to sort of think critically about that when you're looking at your conservation goals and those sorts of things, as with many things. So we focused on the east branch of the Little Calumet River Conservation Corridor. And this has been a huge project for us and many partners that I'm sure I've mentioned at Urban Waters meetings before. But this map sort of shows from the Porter-LaPorte County border into the national park, that stretch of river we've really worked hard on and gone from something like 35 acres less than 10 years ago to now close to 500 acres on the little Calumet that we have preserved. So all those yellow areas are Shirley Heinze Land Trust areas, nature preserves. So you can see that that's kind of connecting between the Heron Rookery and the National Park headquarters, the Dunes Learning Center, Howe Road area. And that stretch pretty much is the river trail as well. So it's allowed people to get a lot of public access on the river. And like I said, Shirley Heinze thinks that's important. The more people that get out there, the more people appreciate nature, appreciate conservation, and support our mission. A lot of these sites are basically floodplain wetlands along the river. So you can see some of those dark areas are wet. They're always wet. They fill up with water during flooding times. And then upland forest, and some of the forests are pretty significant. Got some mature forest area, but you can see that along the borders outside of that is development or agriculture. So a lot of what we protect when we did conservation action planning, which a lot of our partners were involved with, generally our conservation goals are these floodplain areas and then also the upland forests adjacent to them. So those two habitats together form sort of a dynamic that I'll talk about a little bit, but that sort of helps with climate change as well, that we have a little bit of both, right? So that's what we're working with. This is straight out of that US Forest Service book. This is the framework approach that we used, and it sort of shows the project components, but we're establishing partnerships. So like I said, we do a lot of collaboration with partners, and that's really important when you're discussing climate change and something that big that impacts all of us, that we don't do it in a bubble and we don't do it alone, and we get a lot of diverse opinions and things like that. Then we had to assess the ecosystem vulnerabilities. So we have to know a little bit about the ecosystems in the corridor, and then sort of predict how predicted climate change might impact those ecosystems. Then the adaptation resources. So through that book and through the framework process, there's basically a menu of things to choose from that will help you build climate resiliency. So basically management tactics. A lot of us that have done management plans, we call those like goals and objectives, or objectives and tasks. That sort of thing. But that's basically what they are, is like goals that you would add to your management plan and tasks to complete that will improve climate resiliency. And then the adaptation demonstrations part is sort of like the implementation part, right? Like, you know, all this information now, what do you do with it? What do you plan to do with it? So we started with partnerships, and some of you joined us. We're very appreciative. We had a couple of staff members from the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science came and sort of directed and guided all the exercises. And then we had folks from Open Lands, Wetlands Initiative, Audubon, Great Lakes, and of course our own staff were there to work through this workshop. And we're very grateful for that. This was a sort of a grueling 2-day workshop of thinking really critically about climate change and about how these ecosystems are impacted. And we did all those little things with Post-it notes and do we agree, do we disagree sort of thing. But it really kind of boils down to knowing a little bit about the ecosystem and knowing a little bit about what's predicted, and sort of making some assumptions and predictions about what could happen, right? And based on those predictions, like, what do we do to manage it to make those things have less of an impact or build resiliency? So we started by going over some of the regional climate change predictions. And this project was not to determine what those are. There's a lot of information out there about this. And I'll, at the end, I have a few different links or suggestions of places to look for that type of information. But that's been done, right? There's models, there's information, we know what's happening. But in general, to give you an overview, in our area, it's predicted to get warmer over time. The next 50, 100 years is what a lot of the models look at. There's going to be an increased number of extremely hot days, which will also bring drought events. So we could expect to see greater drought events in the summer. And it's also at the same time predicted to get wetter, but that water is expected to come in fewer, more increased storm events and flooding during like the spring and fall season. It's predicted that there'll be an increased growing season with less ice and altered freeze-thaw cycle. And that's really important to stewardship. And we've seen that happen already, where we've had winters where we're waiting for frozen ground in order to implement some of our stewardship activities, and it just never really happens, or it never happens good enough that the ground's been frozen for long enough to do that work. And altered phenology, that basically, phenology is like when things happen in a plant or wildlife's life cycle. So when do the flowers come out and bloom for the season, or when do they drop seed? And the concern is like, will the flowers bloom time and the bees coming out for the season not match up anymore? And those sorts of things could be disastrous. And it's predicted that there'll be a loss of suitable habitat and some species loss. We do know that there's sensitive species in our area, some species that are usually found in more northern climates that are sort of at the southern extent of their range in a lot of our properties. And you might see those species totally lost from some of our systems. Associated with that also is range shifts. So plants that are maybe more in a southern Indiana climate might be moving northward and moving into our area. So we might lose some species and we might gain some new species. So there'll be these new novel sort of species, plant communities and wildlife communities that we've never seen before. So a couple of years ago, we had Orbis Environmental Consulting did a pretty extensive study on the Little Calumet River. Like I said, we've done a lot of conservation action planning. So they basically looked at some of our major properties along the river and did some habitat assessment, determined that there's these number of plant communities. For ease of doing the project, we sort of lumped those into groups to just say upland forest, floodplain forest, and marsh. So a lot of those, are just more specific plant communities within those sort of larger ecosystems. But that's what we looked at, and the framework process and the U.S. Forest Service, a lot of that focuses on forest habitats. So there's a lot to do with trees and such. So we kind of wanted to lump them into those groups. So that's what we went with, and that's what we sort of assessed it as. Our area through the framework process is called the urban forest area. For obvious reasons, we're part of that sort of greater Chicagoland region, and we are a lot more urban than, say, forests to the east or forests to the south of us that have maybe larger stands of continuous forest. So we looked at the river and we looked at all these ecosystems, and we know these predictions that are expected to happen. So basically the vulnerability assessment is saying, okay, if we get more drought, how's that going to affect our floodplain forests? So we said, okay, well, if there's more drought or there's more floods, that's going to alter plant community assemblages. More flooding is going to bring more runoff of nutrients. There's going to be more erosion problems. Public access might be closed because the trails are flooded. We might get more invasive species because flooding sort of changed the plant community so much, and there's a lot of bare spots now. You might see an increase in pests like ticks and mosquitoes that will also damage public access. But also, like, if the ground's not frozen, we can't get out and do winter work with equipment. Or if there's a drought, we might not be spraying herbicide because it might not work so well because everything's under drought stress right now, right? So it's not only how will it impact these systems, but how will it impact what Shirley Heinze does and how we run our stewardship program. And these are just some of them. There was quite a few, and that's a lot already. And there was a couple of sort of, could you predict any benefits that would happen with climate change? And there was a few, but not much. So like, for example, maybe if there's an extended growing season, that means we'll have more time to spray invasive species, right? But I'll give up climate change for a little less time to have invasive species treatments. Before we go on, just to cover a few of the terms, I don't know if you can see on your screen, but it says adapted from a presentation I saw by Dr. Sheila Schuler at University of Michigan. We went to a Stewardship Network conference and saw her give this presentation, but I believe a lot of other people have basically used this concept model. So the concept is just the difference between resistance, resilience, and transition. So we have an ecosystem, and it's fairly stable, sort of by that low U curve. It's very stable and in its position as a stable ecosystem. And resistance is like, if some disturbance happens, that ecosystem doesn't change. So that might be like a storm that drops a couple of trees or something in a forest, right? That happens and the storm drops a couple of trees, but the forest is still a forest and it doesn't really change much. It sort of resisted that disturbance. But resilience is different. And in climate change discussions, we use these terms interchangeably a lot, but resilience really kind of means a different thing. Resilience means that it might change or sway, but it will sort of come back to that stable state. And a good example might be invasive species. Invasive species might ruin a forest and dominate with honeysuckle or something like that. But if we go and remove that invasive species, it kind of comes back to that stable state. That forest wasn't lost because of that disturbance. But transition is different. Transition is that the forest or whatever ecosystem you're looking at is actually going to transition into a new, totally different, stable state. And you could get it back to a forest, but that's sort of difficult to do. You have to go backwards, back over that hump. An example of that might be like the emerald ash borer. So it comes into a floodplain forest and wipes out a lot of ash trees. Those are the dominant trees. Now it's no longer a floodplain forest. It's more of an emergent floodplain marsh. And of course, we could go plant trees in there, but those trees are going to be sort of difficult to take because it's a floodplain and it washes out a lot. And even if we do get them to take, it's going to take 50, 100 years or so before that's a forested floodplain again. So that push back up over that hill is a little bit difficult to get. And then the worst case scenario is that something transitions and there's no longer ecosystem function and there's ecosystem lost. So what we want to try to do is build these things into the habitat. We want to build greater resilience, right? Because resilience means that it can take some of that and it can change and it's going to change, right? Or it might transition and sort of come back, but it still comes back to a stable state. So an ecosystem with very low resistance, every little disturbance is going to make it change to a new ecosystem type. It's going to be very different and eventually it's just quickly going to be lost. So what we want to do is sort of slow that process down by increasing the resilience. So after doing the vulnerability assessment, like I said, there's a whole menu of strategies and approaches for putting into your management plans or putting into your management practice. So these are the 10 strategies, and then under each one of those strategies, they had a number of different approaches. And this table just shows how much those strategies contribute to resistance, resilience, or transition, right? So some of the things on there you see, like number 1 is sustain fundamental ecological functions, or number 7 is promote landscape connectivity. For us, for Shirley Heinze, and for a lot of our partners that are doing land management, like these are key to a stewardship program already, right? So like I said, we've always thought about climate change. It's always been in our management plans, right? Climate change is happening and we have concerns about that. And I guess the point that I want to hit home in this presentation is that a lot of the approaches for making a more resilient landscape is basically like a lot of the things that we all kind of share in common anyways, right? It's what the conservation community is trying to do in a lot of ways. So you'll see things, and Open Lands talks about nature-based solutions, right? And those nature-based solutions are the nature that we're always trying to protect and preserve. So sustaining fundamental ecological functions is a key underlying element in all of ecology and restoration and stewardship. That's what we want the most. That's what we're trying to obtain. Maintaining biological diversity is very important to us. Landscape connectivity and landscape redundancy, biodiversity, all of those things are basically the foundation of what makes a land trust, right? That's what we're trying to do, is connect landscapes, lessen fragmentation, protect biodiversity, protect rare ecosystems. So these things aren't a stretch for us to do to build climate resiliency. All we're trying to do is think a little bit more critically about it and keep it sort of front of mind as we move forward in our management planning and in our tactics. So here's a good example under number 1 of sustained fundamental ecological functions. So we picked and chose from these menus, and we added some of these things into our management plan in a section where we added a few pages. So reduce impacts to soils and nutrient cycling are things like only using equipment on the ground when it's really frozen or very dry. Trying to maintain or restore hydrology is like filling in ditches, slowing water runoff, improving and restoring wetlands. Maintain or restore riparian areas is like all we're doing on the Little Calumet River, right? Like I said, most of it is either floodplain or upland forest adjacent to the floodplain, and that's our major focus there. So again, like a lot of these things are in line with what we're already doing and what we've always been doing. We took this a step further when we added it into management plans and added some of the bits, like I just said, like another level, which would be like objectives or tasks that we would actually implement in the field underneath each of these strategies and approaches. So there's quite a bit to go through. There was some that we did steer away from. The one thing that we're not doing as of yet, there's that whole idea of the climate's going to change, so we should move new species into our nature preserves that aren't there now, but could be there in 50 to 100 years as the climate changes. We're not so comfortable with that yet, but there are things that maybe as we see them shifting their range into our area, we might leave that and not say that that's an exotic species that doesn't belong here. We're going to say, wow, that's only found a few counties south of us. It's never been here before. And we might monitor and maintain that. But I'm not planting new tree species that are only found in southern Indiana here now. One of the other things that's in there that doesn't really pertain to us, there's a lot about restoring right after great disturbances, and what they're really referring to is like disastrous wildfires in the West. We don't get a lot of that. If there's a storm that knocks down a few trees, it's not like we go out with a crew to like fix the trees that fell down and try to improve resilience that way. The forest can essentially handle those things, but we're not dealing with disastrous wildfires that wipe out thousands of acres, so they're kind of irrelevant to us. We had to talk about what monitoring we have and how that monitoring can be better geared towards climate change. So these are some of the monitoring things that we do. We visit every site annually. I showed you some of the invasive species monitoring we do with Art Collector. We do that with EdMaps a lot with new invaders. One of the things that we haven't done that we're trying to get into is doing water quality monitoring. Obviously on the river, that's important. And we want to see that, we want to have a baseline, do some monitoring, know that over time, some of the efforts that we make are having an impact on water quality. So turbidity, oxygen levels, temperature, just even flood levels as we start to create new wetlands and things like that. We want to see that that's having an impact on the river itself and the water quality in our area. So the demonstration part is like, okay, what do you do with this? And we did add, like I said, a few pages about the project in our management plan for the East Branch corridor, and a lot of new management tactics. A lot of them were similar to ones that we already had, but there was a few new ones that we weren't doing before. We asked Orbis to go back and sort of add an addendum to their original report that talked about climate change and how it might impact some of these rare species, because a lot of their work was involved with the plant populations. There being rare sedges there that, you know, are county records and things like that. And we said, okay, like, what does climate change mean for these plants? And there may be some plant species that will act more like indicators for us that we might keep a more careful eye on or do a little bit more monitoring with to see if climate change is causing a loss of those types of species. And we've also tried to start working this climate change initiative and these things into our next grant proposals and things. So we do have a Shy Cow Fund proposal in now, where we're going to do some water and soil management type of stuff. We have something that was an ag field that we converted to a forest that is within the river's floodplain. So we're trying to just slow water flow off of that floodplain area. It only really gets water when it's flooded, and then kind of drains back into the ditches. And we want to create some low spots in water and maintain that infiltration. We're also looking to recreate wetlands. Shirley Heinze has done a lot with wetland enhancements, a lot with sort of restoration, but we've never done a wetland creation yet. We're looking to do about 30 to 40 acres of that in the next few years. EQIP and agriculture BMPs, we're trying to work more closely with NRCS and Porter County Soil and Water and other partners to implement ourselves best management practices, but also promote best management practices to farmers and producers around us. So out in that Heron Rookery area, there's a lot of agriculture, there's a lot of drainage ditches, there's a lot of things that are associated or surrounding our nature preserves in the rivers. So at some point, there's not more forest to protect outside of us, but there is agriculture, and improving management practices for more sustainable management practices isn't a bad thing, right? And we've also been looking at a remeander project to do that with the National Park Service and with Porter County Drainage to do some floodplain restoration there, maybe around the Heron Rookery. So we're fingers crossed, we're looking to keep progressing that. That will obviously take a long time and a number of years. But this is sort of some of the ways, like I said, we're trying to get our stewardship program beyond invasive species treatments and into more impactful projects that are new to us and outside of our toolbox, and really expanding the way that we think and do things. There's a number of other things we can do. These aren't so much resiliency building as much as they're more like climate mitigation things, right? So it's things that we all do in our regular life, and Shirley Heinze does to some degree. And we just want to continue to improve the things like using less plastics, being more energy efficient, driving less, composting more, including things like bioswales and rain gardens in some of our design. So we have a home-based Meadowbrook in Valparaiso, and then we have a new area, Leidick Bog, out in St. Joseph County, where we're doing some master planning to make those more publicly accessible recreation type of areas, places where people can gather and visit and have some structures and buildings and things like that. But associated with that master planning comes some green initiatives and things that can really sort of improve sustainability. And then also, of course, things like this and communicating, talking about climate change, adding it to our informational signage, adding it to our social media and website posts, and promotion of best management practices on all ends. So Shirley Heinze has this mission of including people, and we want to create a culture of conservation all around us. And it's really important to have the support of the communities that you work in and things like that. So I said that there would be a couple of resources. You can see like a summary of this project if you go to forestadaptation.org. It's the climate change response framework, and all those little points on the map are all different projects. There's a really great project, the Chicago Wilderness Climate Action Plan for Nature is on there. and it's got a lot of detailed information. We actually used a lot of information out of that when we were adding stuff to our management plans. They did a great assessment of different native trees and how they will be impacted by climate change. The Indiana Dunes Climate Adaptation Plan is more recent, and you can see that on Save the Dunes website. Open Lands has a lot of great information on their website. It's really informative, a really great place for resource. Nature Conservancy shares a lot of their information and data. The Resilient and Connected Landscapes map, you can look at their map and sort of see areas that have, they've predicted greater resiliency to climate change. And of course, Purdue puts out a lot of information. They have a climate change research center. So a lot of great local information out there, a lot of good resources. So just to summarize, we have a pretty hefty stewardship program, and we're always improving. And I feel like the stewardship program has always been doing great things to improve climate resiliency. And now we're sort of adding a label to that and thinking a little bit more critically about it in the forefront of our minds. The climate change response framework, I really encourage you to go to the forestadaptation.org and look at some of those different projects, because it's the one that I'm talking about is just about land management, but there's a lot of great projects there that are more community based or more a municipality making sort of a climate adaptation plan type of thing. So there's a great diversity of projects in there. It's not just like stewardship and restoration things. Like I said, many of the strategies are similar to just good stewardship practice, but we're trying to be a little more sophisticated and add new tools to our toolbox and sort of add an additional level of climate resiliency consideration in everything that we're doing now. The additional actions that support climate resiliency and mitigation, I encourage you all to try and live a lifestyle of sustainability and do the best you can to limit climate change. And then communications and talking about it. So don't be afraid to talk to people about climate change. It's not as controversial as you might think. A lot of people understand what we're trying to do when we talk about these things. And with that, I'm happy to spend some time and answer questions and those sorts of things. The photos are actually Meadowbrook. At Meadowbrook and other areas, we've planted a lot of trees, but it's been about 5 years since our first tree planting, and we're starting to see a lot of trees come in. So very proud of that as well. Thanks.
Wow, thank you so much, Eric. That was really a fantastic presentation, really exciting project to learn more about. We do still have quite a bit of time that we can handle some questions. I did want to ask a few myself, if I could kick that off. I did see, thank you for sharing that link to the forest adaptation resources. Forestadaptation.org. I'm going to post one in the comments that I looked through. It looks as though that U.S. Forest Service document that that you referred to can be accessed through that site, but I am posting what I believe is the Forest Service.
Yeah,
Okay, yep. So just thought that might be useful, but you can also navigate to that through the link that Eric shared as well. I did have a couple of questions come in. One, Eric, are you okay with us sharing your slides after the presentation?
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I figured, but I thought I'd just confirm before I promised it. So I will go ahead and share those via the e-news and maybe post them in the calendar link that people should have.
And I'll be honest, like some of those like pictures when I talked about mitigation and stuff are just totally taken off of Google or something. So don't make money on it or anything like that, or somebody else's pictures.
Okay, sure. Yep. And we can maybe provide them as PDF too. I did have another question that came in asking if you are doing anything with LaPorte County farmers. I know you had mentioned, working with the farmers kind of in that area near Heron Rookery. So it sounds as though you are working with farmers. I think it's just curiosity if you're working with through kind of LaPorte County, Porter County, SWCD. How are you going about that?
So thus far, we've only scratched the surface. We're trying to, Shirley Heinze never had any agriculture or working lands program before, and we're trying to work that into our organization. So we've mostly been working with Porter County NRCS and Porter County Soil and Water right now, because that's immediately surrounding our properties. But yeah, there's no reason why we wouldn't move into LaPorte County. I mean, we are there on the border, and that LaPorte County is where the headwaters are. Of course, we want to do that. But we don't have a lot thus far that, like, I don't have any protected farmland or anything like that as of yet.
Great, thank you. I believe that's all the comments that I've seen in the group chat so far. And some people just wanting to confirm, yes, we are recording. So with that, I will go ahead and open it up to anyone else who has questions for Eric. You can continue to type those into the group chat. Or I believe you should be able to, everyone is muted at this point, but I believe everyone should be able to unmute themselves if you'd like to ask a question.
And I'll mention, you had mentioned the publication from the Forest Service. So that forestadaptation.org is a lot of stuff adapted from there, but the U.S. Forest Service themselves puts out a lot of publications, like actual peer-reviewed publications and science data and stuff like that. They are a storehouse of different publications and things that you can get a lot of great information on management from. I can't really see the chats on my thing. I don't know how to do that.
Oh, you can't. Okay. Yeah, let me, and I can let you know as I see them.
Oh, I can see.
Yeah, there's a chat. If you hover at the bottom of the screen, there's sort of a text chat icon. But yeah, I'm not seeing any more typed in. Lots of good feedback, and thank you.
Cool, yes, and I encourage you to, if you're doing land management in any way, or even if you're involved with a municipality or something like that and want to do some climate change type of work, I really encourage you to look through the publication. I'm pretty sure you can get it as a PDF as well. If nothing more, it's very easy read. It's very easy to sort of glance through and just get a lot of good information about what to think about and how to take those next steps.
So Eric, would you consider this kind of a pilot project for you guys? Do you anticipate doing a similar process for some of your other sort of target areas, or just kind of bits and pieces as you incorporate some of these considerations into your other plans?
So this was kind of meant to be a model to add it into our management plans. And then pretty much directly after we finished the assessment and all this stuff, we hit COVID, and we started, all my stewardship staff was working from home, and we had a lot of updating to do on our management plans. So we have been including this in other management plans. My most important ones are Ambler and Ivanhoe and our dune and swale areas out there. We feel like those might be the most susceptible to climate change. But it's sort of like, once you go through the process and you come down to those management tactics, to do it for another site is a lot easier, because you're like, okay, you know, I've done this already. And the Little Cow was a little more difficult than a place like Ambler for us, because it's a little more new to us, whereas Ambler we've been working in for 20 plus years, so we're a lot more familiar with all the sites and some of those kinds of things. So it was sort of easier to just slip in those strategies and that information after doing this one. Someone commented on my shirt, my Calumet Heritage Area. I'm very proud to be part of that.
That's great.
Well, thank you all for having me. Like I said, part of the project was to communicate this work to our partners, and thank you, Jen, for allowing me this platform to do that. And like I said, I really encourage you, if you're thinking about these kinds of things, to look at that Forest Service information. There's a lot of great information there. And I also found a lot of great just resource information from that Chicago Wilderness Action Plan that's just was a really helpful read for me.
Great. Yeah, and I do see another question, Eric, coming in on the chat. The question is, how are you all working to balance resilience priorities that you learned during this process versus general invasive control, where you only see certain sites 1 time per year and an expanding portfolio?
So we see all of our sites at least 1 time per year. There's a few that we do less management on. There's sort of a priority scale, right? There's state dedicated properties where we visit them quite a bit. We're doing a lot of management. Then there's smaller, what we call like green space properties, which are not necessarily remnant habitat or something like that. They're just green space. So they serve connectivity, or what people used to call buffer, right? A lot of buffer areas. One of the key things that we took away from this project that we started implementing, I have a few new tree plantings, and through that Chicago Wilderness Assessment, and I think the Forest Service just has a general menu as well, they identified trees that would do better or worse in predicted climate future. We didn't exclude trees that would do worse, but we started weighing less on them. I believe black cherry was one of them. That is a very common tree in our forests, predicted to not do so well in the future climate, and therefore we scaled back on that when we do new tree plantings and add a little bit more oaks or something like that that are predicted to be more resilient to climate change. So that's one way we've changed. In invasive species management, in a lot of ways, when you read that information, it's like invasive species and other things that are also stressors to the ecosystem are just a greater stressor. So relieving some of that stress improves resiliency. But you know, there's this thing with land managers where we could spend 100% of our time and of our life just treating invasive species and running around in circles by the time we get one place done and others just starting. So a lot of that is just prioritization and choosing the more resilient communities and the more remnant communities. There was a big part in there about redundancy and protecting those rare ecosystems. So it's kind of a change in priority as to what we're working on and where we're working. This sort of helps guide that in a way.
Great, thank you, Eric. I do see another question regarding if there are any plans for access to Grand Cal at your site off Kennedy Avenue between Hammond and Gary. Kayak.
So if they mean river access, no, but you can go to Seidner, Dune and Swale. You go on Kennedy and you go just under the toll road and you turn right. There's a side street. It looks like you're going into the Resco plant, and you just park outside the gate and try and be off the street. We try and clear off the area for parking, and then it kind of fills in again. There's a lot of different people that work there, but there is an entrance. That was one of my first pictures, that wooden gate with the fence and sign on it. It looks like you can't be there, but you can. We also have recently, every year we do a bus tour. This year we're going to do like a virtual bus tour. So I have made some sort of guided hike videos that will be up probably by mid-September or so. So if you don't want to go to Seidner, you can also just see my video and see me hiking there and talking about the plants and river. But it's a great birding site. You can go there. If you want to go there with a group or something, like, contact us and we can open up that gate. That gate is just also a right of way, and we don't own all of that roadway property.
Great. I do have another comment in the chat saying which, if any, invasives will be hurt or helped by climate change that could help set priorities. I would imagine that's a pretty big question to answer with all the different species. So
some of the things that's very important for EDMAPs, early detection, rapid response type of things. So species that are invasive further south could be doing better and better in our area. So we want to be watching out for those species. Some of those things are already moving this way, but also like insects and disease and things like that. You sort of combat that by monitoring. I mean, monitoring is all you can do, and if you find them, report them and treat them and those sorts of things as fast as possible. The Orbis addendum did identify that, okay, so you have a lot more flooding, and that might change some of the plant communities that are along that floodplain. And let's say they're underwater more, and now they turn into more bare ground. That can lead to a lot more ruderal species, so sort of those early pioneer successional species, and a lot more invasives coming in that way. But I have a world of invasive species we've been working on. I don't think that, you know, like purple loosestrife is going to disappear because of the climate. It's all over the country. Most of the ranges of invasive species are kind of everywhere, right? The top ones that we're worried about are much more places than just Indiana. So I don't think they're going to go away or anything.
Great. I do see a comment that the Field Museum and Morton Arboretum will also be releasing a tree field guide soon that includes the data and recommendations from the climate adaptation plan. So thank you for that.
Yeah, that's great. And that was kind of the most helpful information. I mean, I obviously don't have the resources and abilities to do that big of an assessment by myself. So seeing that sort of tree data and getting that out to land managers that plant trees is, I think, very important.
Great. Okay, we have just about 4 minutes left, maybe time for one or two other pressing questions, if anyone has them. Okay, well, Eric, I do want to thank you again for that wonderful presentation. Urban Waters is really excited to work with you on this. I'm really glad that we could bring this information to all of our partners and our partnership. We did have a really great turnout. I think we had over 50 participants. So
yeah, I'm so surprised. That's amazing. Thank you.
I'm not surprised because it's a great topic and it was a great presentation. But as follow-up, I will be sending out, this is the first kind of webinar that we've done. So we're still learning how to best go about things, but I will be sharing certainly your slides. I will have, all of the meeting is being recorded, so we will figure out how to get that out to folks. And yeah, thanks so much. Really appreciate your time and the information.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Have a great week.
You too, thanks.